Well, welcome to the first QED debate. Is science the new religion? And hopefully we'll get an answer. So before we move on to the debate, let me introduce our panelists. To my left, we have Brendan O'Neill, and he is the editor of Spiked, which is a magazine that apparently wants to make history as well as report it. He's a columnist for The Big Issue in London and The Australian. He blogs for the Daily Telegraph, and I think, in fact, he used to blog for The Guardian. And he's written for a variety of publications, both in this country and in America. And he has written Can I Recycle My Granny? And 39 other eco-dilemmas. And he's currently researching a book on snobbery. Moving on, we've got Robin Ince in the middle. Probably familiar to most of you. He seems to be on pretty much everything we're doing at QED. He is a comedian and tireless supporter of science and scepticism, the co-presenter of The Infinite Monkey Cage, and he's the controlling mind behind 9 Lessons and Carols for Godless People. And perhaps most importantly, he is the winner of an Occam at last year's QED. In fact, the Occam he got was for Best Event. So he's transcended mere humanity and has become an event. So there we are. And then we have Helen Czerski, who most of you, I'm sure, will have heard her marvellous talk this morning. Physicist and oceanographer based at the Institute for Science and Vibration Research at the University of Southampton. You can tell I've got most of this from Wikipedia, can't I?
It's the Institute of Sound and Vibration.
There we go. She is a broadcaster. She's co-presented with Kate Humble a 3-part series, Orbit, Earth's Extraordinary Journey. She's also appeared on Operation Iceberg and the Museum of Curiosity, which I think, in fact, was also by Stephen Colbert.
Yes.
Yes, there we go. She has also been responsible for the Transit of Venus, a Horizon programme, stargazing challenges, and she has appeared on Scrap Heap Challenge. She created what I believe was a welly throwing machine.
Yeah, I've got a trebuchet that could be powered using my own weight, wearing diving weights.
Yep.
So not very heavy.
I'd Google it if I were you, because there's a lovely picture of Helen on a trebuchet. She came an honourable second, I think, in that episode. And finally, on the end, we have Jeff Forshaw. Jeff is a professor of theoretical physics at the University of Manchester. He specialises in the physics of elementary particles. He was awarded the Institute of Physics Maxwell Medal in 1999 for outstanding contributions to theoretical physics. He's co-written a number of international bestsellers, Why Does E = MC Squared, and The Quantum Universe, Everything That Can Happen Does Happen. He wasn't in D-Ring. So, is science the new religion? Format, we're going to give each of our speakers maybe 3-4 minutes just to open on the debate, and we'll move left to right. So, Brendan, is science the new religion?
Thank you. Throughout history, one of the main arguments against allowing ordinary people to get involved in politics was the idea that they lacked expertise. So if you look back to the debate about universal male suffrage in the 19th century, one of the key arguments made was, yes, these working men are all very well, they're good with their hands, they build these lovely cities that we live in, but they're not cut out for politics, because in the word of one Tory, they don't have the expertise or experience that politics requires. If you look at the debate about the suffragettes in the early 20th century, the same thing was said again. These women are fantastic, they look after our homes, they raise our children. Some of them have jobs, which is fine by us, but they don't really do politics very well. And in the word of one opponent of female suffrage, women lack the expertise in naval, military, commercial, diplomatic, and legal matters, which is necessary for informed political activity. And also, one of the key justifications for having second chambers, whether it's the House of Lords in Britain or the Senate in America, has been the idea that we need experts to keep a watchful eye on commoners and their representatives. So the idea that we need expertise in politics is actually a very old idea. It's been around for a long time, and I think it's always been on the wrong side of the debate about democracy. It's always been an idea which tends to depict ordinary people as insufficiently enlightened for serious political debate, for complicated political matters like war and law and so on. And this outlook survives today in the widespread belief that we need more experts in politics, that we need less ideology, more expertise, that we need more cool-headed scientists and advisors who can tell governments what they ought to do, what's right and what's wrong. But we need more educated people like David Nutt and fewer nutters from the street who think they know everything but actually don't know very much at all. But I think today's demand for expertise in politics is even worse than the demands in the past because they are so sweeping. Because the idea is that we now need expertise in pretty much every single sphere of policy making. And I think when you mix politics and science together like this, you actually damage both of them. You damage politics because you make it more rigid. When politics is driven by evidence and science, it becomes much more difficult to have a heated moral debate about what society ought to do. Because if you oppose the idea that we need early years intervention to prevent children's brains from being warped by neglectful parents, you're accused of being anti-scientific. Debate gets automatically shut down. You're a heretic if you question government policy because you're questioning scientific fact. So politics becomes stiffer, more rigid, less easy to challenge. And I think science suffers too because it inevitably becomes polluted. It seems absolutely undeniable to me that if you have a situation where politicians who feel that they lack the moral authority to push their agendas go searching for scientific authority instead, it seems just undeniable that that is going to pollute science. If you call on scientists to provide you with the means through which you can push through a policy, you're going to end up warping science, making it biased, finding the results you want to find. And I think some scientists, sadly, are paying up to that and are doing effectively what governments want them to do. We often hear complaints about corporate-funded science and how terrible that is. But I think we should stop and think about public-funded science and the role that it plays today, the way in which it's used by governments to push through agendas that they had already decided on, in fact, but they just want a nice form of authority to justify them. And then finally, the worst thing about all this mixing of politics and science is that it definitely shrinks the sphere for public engagement, I think. In the same way that the demand in the past that politics should be left to experts also shrunk the sphere for public engagement. And it sidelines ordinary people. Sidelines people who may not be as clever as some of the people in this room, but who do have morals and ideas and beliefs and a desire to be autonomous. And those are the only things you need to do politics.
Okay. Well, I don't even know what this debate's about, and I don't know what that was to do with this debate. I really don't understand this side. I genuinely don't know. Firstly, is science the new religion? I think is ridiculous. We have to then go through some ghastly semantics about what religion means. But I think the problem I have with, and I'm sorry because I haven't written a speech, so I'm only just going to pick up on some of your points, which are, firstly, this idea of that science is separate. Science is this separate thing, and then there's politics, which is a separate thing, and there's no shaded area of a kind of Venn diagram, whatever you want to say, which is, and the idea that scientists, they're not commoners. I don't know who the commoners are, by the way. I don't know. I mean, there's various things I'd like to know. Firstly, I suppose, if we go in reverse order, when you talk about agendas being pushed through due to science, I wondered if you could give me an example, because I quite often, whenever I hear this debate, I hear a lot of things that are said in a very woolly manner, but I don't hear actual examples of going, oh, I see, evidence was used to push this through. That seems a little bit unfair, because as opposed to evidence, they should have gone with something someone thought in a dream. I'm genuinely, I don't mean that in a facetious manner. What I think is that our society, and I've written about this before and had a lot of trouble from philosophers of science, who are an interesting group, but that we are built in an evidence-based world. Now, I'm not talking about whether it's scientists doing this, whoever it is. When we talk about experts, we've kind of got to this position now where the moment someone is looked at as an expert, you go, oh, don't trust them. They're an expert. They spent a lot of time studying this. So when we're looking at things like drugs policy, which I do know is a very difficult thing to deal with in terms of what people's gut instinct versus evidence, and it will be possibly a slow process to get to what might be socially the best thing. The moment you're dealing with human minds, you have problems. But I want people who really know what they're talking about to help lead any debate where evidence can be involved. I think evidence should be there. And some people may well have. First of all, I suppose, I want to know, who are these commoners who we're just brushing aside? Because actually, if you look at what happens in government, a lot of the time, so much is now media-led. You see some of the bullshit that's been pushed through because of the way the newspapers are and the way the media is, as opposed to, yet again, evidence and right thinking and the scientists have won. It's an incredible battle, and a very difficult battle. And we look at the opinions on things like climate change, and we see that many people have been misled. I mean, you wrote an article, for instance, after Johnny Ball did the thing at an event that I was doing. You wrote a piece, which I then wrote to you, remember, we had a couple of emails back and forth about this, where you weren't at the event. And none of the journalists who actually wrote it, the only journalist who was at the event who kind of wrote a piece went, and then Johnny Ball went mad. The people who weren't there had a very different take on it, which suited their angle that they required for their piece, which was that Johnny Ball was not allowed to bring up any sense of criticism of current thought on man-made climate change. He was booed off. Now, that's not what happened. What happened was, he did his allotted 8 minutes, which then became 10 minutes. Then he started talking about climate change. For 8 minutes, as he continually said, climate change is bullshit, a reasonably scientific literate audience allowed him to keep talking. It was fine, and it became a little bit uneasy, but they thought, it's Johnny Ball, and he's inspired a lot of people. Then when he actually got to saying East Anglia Climate Change Unit has shown that it's bullshit, that there are lies, that they have lied, and they have lied statistics, etc., that's where one person thought, no, that's not what happened. And 20 minutes into his 8-minute set, someone shouted out, shame, sir, shame. And then people kind of went, he has overrun by 12 minutes. He has now done 8 minutes of which we sat through and we listened to something we didn't agree with, but now he's pushed it to the point where we're a little bit cross. This was turned into, in newspapers, Johnny Ball's not allowed to talk about climate change. That's not what happened. In fact, I spoke to him for 2 hours the next day. I said, Johnny, you can do whatever you want. I certainly didn't say you're not allowed to go on the stage for the next 8 gigs that I had him booked for. I said, you go on every night and you do whatever you want. I said, there is no censorship here. The only thing you have to do is make sure you do your allotted time.
Exactly. And you're over your allotted time.
Sorry. My summing up is, I don't understand how using evidence is somehow an oppression of the common man. This, to me, is an illusion.
Now, obviously, we'll allow Brendan to come back on these points, but Helen.
Robin started talking and I thought it's going to be longer than 4 minutes.
Sorry.
So I would like to... We're not really discussing science and religion here, so I'm going to pick up on the points you made because I think this is the debate we're having. And it seems to me that there is there are two things being confused here. And you were talking, and I'm not saying this to attack you specifically, I'm saying this because I want to separate out these two issues because it seems that this is the crux of the debate. What science does is it collects evidence, it looks at it, tries to understand it, and then presents a model for what's happening and may use that model to make predictions. And it's the purest job of a scientist is to say, this is our evidence about the current situation, this is our best judgment as to what's happening, and these are the probabilities of different things happening in the future. Now, a scientist presenting that to a policymaker is not the same as a policymaker being told what to do. It's the job of the policymaker to take the evidence from science, from economics, from human morality, and wherever else they may get their, whatever other influences they may have, and it is then the job of society and the job of the common man to say, we decide to do this. And the thing about the evidence-based thing in science is that politicians always want to be evidence-based, so they misuse evidence. And the problem with that is it devalues evidence. And what we want is a society that is comfortable in saying, we understand that our best scientific judgment is that if we do this, there's an 80% chance that this will happen. Now, we don't like whatever's going to happen, but we understand for these other reasons that we are going to do it anyway. And that is where science sits in society, because you cannot have a debate about anything without some evidence. How can you discuss what homeless people are doing if you don't know how many homeless people there are? How can you discuss, what we should do about the climate if we don't understand how the climate works? And the other thing I would say about the common man is that science explicitly gives power to the common man because everybody in a certain situation has the chance to go and test it out. I would draw everyone's attention to the Berkeley Statistics Project on climate change recently. And this is an exact example of the type of democracy that science allows. A load of climate skeptics and mathematicians got together and went, we're statisticians. We can look at the evidence independently. They funded a massive project at Berkeley in California. They took the evidence, they took the data, all the data available. They went through it with a fine-tooth comb, looking to see whether the evidence supported the claims made by the IPCC about human-induced climate change. And the result they came up with was an even stronger statement in favour of the judgment that humans are causing climate change for the specific reasons. The statement was even stronger than the IPCC report, and that is the democracy that science allows. Everyone is allowed to go and look at the evidence. Everyone is allowed to back up their arguments using the evidence, and if the evidence does not support their argument, that's available for everyone to see, and that is democracy.
And she underrun by a minute, which is even better. Jeff?
I hope I'm not in danger of overrunning. So I'd like to, the question, is science the new religion? I think, first of all, I think it can be taken on two levels. I mean, we've not talked actually about the reference to, the implied reference to a worldview. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. The idea that science usurps traditional religion. So this conflating of science with atheism. And that's one way of taking this question. And I think the idea that science is a new religion, in the sense that Brendan is talking about it, so the idea of high priests as being fonts of untouchable knowledge. So I want to talk about both of those quickly. So, and I'll argue that Jenkins and O'Neill have got a point, and that scientists have a lot to learn if their evidence is to be most effectively integrated into the decision-making process. And I'll also argue, dealing with the other part of the question, the other interpretations of the question, that science does not usurp traditional religion. So let me quickly deal with each. So the high priests thing first. So this notion of the high priest of science, which is articulated very directly, and Simon Jenkins uses those words. I don't know if you've used those words, Brendan, but there is a tendency amongst some scientists to speak confrontationally and definitively, and sometimes even mystically. And it seems very arrogant. There's a definite perception that scientists, which is not rare, that there's a connection between being a scientist and being arrogant. That's not to say that there is something to understand. Right? That's not really a matter of opinion. Things happen, and there are certain statements that can be made. Experts should definitely be celebrated and listened to. You wouldn't dream of asking for somebody's opinion on a chess game. It's not a matter of opinion. Gary Kasparov's view is much more important than mine, right? It's clear, right? Airplanes fly because people understand how they fly. You wouldn't trust somebody who doesn't understand how an airplane flies. So certain knowledge, and there's no argument that that's the case. But serious decision making that's based on scientific ignorance is not acceptable. But that is a very far cry from saying that Parliament should be stuffed full of scientists. Right? I think that scientific knowledge helps us to make better decisions, but so does knowledge of the arts and humanities. So we always need to exercise a degree of judgment in the face of evidence. That's true even in the purest of sciences. Like, have we discovered the Higgs boson? No. But much more so in everyday decision making. The role of judgment is absolutely enormous. But it's much more so in everyday decision. An example, it would be tensioning freedom of choice against harmful consequences. The argument over climate change is not clear-cut either. To most, the evidence is plenty sufficient to suggest that we should take great care. But judgment is needed to decide how much care we need to take, because there's a spectrum of possible actions. What is not okay is to be anti-scientific and to try to undermine the evidence using non-scientific means, such as pure ideology or vested interest. Shale gas is another example of tough decision-making. Is it a good or bad idea? Because some people are arguing anti-scientifically does not mean that the scientists should make decisions. Scientists must acknowledge how complicated and non-scientific decision-making actually is. That is why a parliament full of scientists would not be a good idea, and it's why, scientists are just not skilled in the way that politicians are. Let me talk about the other thing, the new worldview. Science is often equated with atheism. but I don't think that's at all logical. To many, scientific discovery is indicated in personal universe, and that makes it hard to be religious. But science does not answer most of the questions that matter. It doesn't tell me what I should do today, how I should live, or, being a bit more ambitious, why is there a universe at all, or is there a meaning to life? It's hardly a religion in that it doesn't deal with those questions.
Can I just pick up on that, Jeff? Because you've overrun a little.
Yeah.
Going back to your point, Brendan, about drugs policy and so on, obviously there was the issue with Professor Nutt. And I think you've both written about the Professor Nutt incident. Brendan, you said this. Why is it any more right for a man of science to say, yes, this drug may be permitted, but this one may not, than it is for a man of the cloth to say, thou shalt not smoke dope? The former's pontification might be based in science, while the latter's is based in religious considerations, but the end result of both are the same. Tiny cliques of people conspire to deny everyday people the right to choose their vices on the basis that those vices might harm them either physically or spiritually. Is that actually the scientists who are conspiring, or is that the government?
That's a very good question. I think the real problem here lies with politicians and the fact that they feel they no longer have the moral authority to push through whatever agenda they're pursuing. For various historical reasons, they feel very alienated, they feel lacking in authority. So they outsource authority to other people. They go looking for authority in other places. And the way in which they do that now is through science. So they court scientists, they court experts, and they look for evidence that would justify what they want to do anyway. So it's mostly the politicians' fault, but scientists do go along with it. There are lots of scientists who very willingly sign up for all this rubbish and who very willingly give governments the evidence that they want. And Robin asked for some examples of policy that's been driven by science in this way. I'll just give you a few examples. Ian Duncan Smith's social justice measures are pretty much all driven by science now, particularly by something called early years science, the idea that a child's brain forms very early in life, and therefore if he's neglected or if he's not read to by his parents a certain number of times, or if he's not treated in the way that the government thinks is correct, then he will be damaged forever. It's very dodgy science. It's actually reminiscent of phrenology and the measurement of skulls and the idea that a certain skull defines you as a person. But that's accepted as the justification for all Ian Duncan Smith's quite authoritarian social measures. The smoking ban, justified by the science of second-hand smoking, which is actually not very strong science, but that a very illiberal measure was justified on scientific basis. There are other examples as well. And I think what's really important about these things is that these are social, moral questions. The question of how parents should bring up their children is a question of morality and autonomy. It's not simply one of science. The question of whether we should be able to go into pubs that allow smoking and other pubs that don't allow smoking should be a social question that people should be allowed to discuss. What's happened with the political exploitation of science and scientists' willingness to go along with it is that those questions have been taken off the democratic agenda and handed over to experts. That's the thing that concerns me. When science is used like that.
You wanted to chip in.
I mean, it's very obvious. You just picked two examples, and the first thing you said about the science in both cases was it wasn't very good. No one on this panel is arguing that we should use science that isn't very good.
Why do scientists not campaigning against the smoking ban?
So the thing about that's a political issue. It's not scientific. It's the job of the scientist to say, if you, we have got evidence that if you smoke, you are highly likely to die of lung cancer, right? Now, what society does with that information is up to society. That's up to the politicians. It is not the responsibility of science. What happens next? We did our job when we said we have collected evidence. If you do this, this is the outcome. Now, other people who are informed by the economic, the moral, whatever other grounds you have, they will make a decision about society. It seems to me that you're complaining about politicians, but not about science.
No, I'm complaining about the relationship between the two. The politicians were provided with loads and loads of evidence that second-hand smoke gives people cancer. I happen to think that evidence is not very good. I've read some of it, not all of it. I'm not a scientist. But I know that there are scientists out there who say it's not reliable evidence. So there's now discussion about, in the European Union, which is the hot seat of crap science, there's now discussion about third-hand smoke. The idea that if someone comes into contact with someone who's been in contact with second-hand smoke, then they will pass it on to someone else. So there's a lot of rubbish science about, which is being used to justify social moral measures. But my argument goes beyond that. I think that even when the science is good and reliable, unlike those sciences, even then I don't think it should be used to drive policy. The best example of that, I think, is climate change. The science of climate change. Okay, fine, human beings are causing climate change through various different things that they're doing. But the question of whether you build coal factories, the question of whether you industrialize Africa, the question of whether you spread development around the third world and watch China grow and grow and grow, these are moral, political questions. And I don't think they should be driven by science or evidence, but driven by what people need and what people want.
Robin, you're dying to chip in.
I'll be very brief on this one. Yeah. There's a difference between policy being science-led. What you've said is not about being science-led. It's been about politicians going, that's the one I want. Not the scientists leading it, but actually going, that's what I need, so I'll use that as my alibi for my education. So they're using certain elements, but that's not science leading it. That's people cherry-picking what they require. That's totally different to science being in charge, and this incredible idea you have that somehow the Nobel Prize winners of the world are manipulating us all. It's not science leading. It's people taking, that's a handy fact.
Well, I think
that's not the same as science being the leader.
I think there's a relationship between those two things. As I said very early on, I think the key problem is politicians. But I think the more this goes on, the more scientists are playing into this. It's so obvious with environmental science in particular. When you have the IPCC, which can turn you from an ordinary, boring scientist who works in some non-entity university into a global superstar who warns the world about catastrophe.
Oh yeah, I saw that
the other week. There are not many.
No,
they don't go to go-to. They go to The Hague and Brussels and Strasbourg and everywhere else. There are not many scientists who are going to be able to resist that. So I think what we're setting in motion is a process whereby scientists are tempted and encouraged to sacrifice their objectivity because they know that there are great rewards for this. Now, I don't understand why people can be so freaked out by corporate-funded science, which I agree is sometimes often problematic, but not freaked out by the fact that scientists are often rewarded politically for coming up with evidence that suits modern-day politicians. That seems to me to be a much more problematic thing for science these days than corporate funding.
What you're talking about is the flaws of all human beings. Some of them are scientists, some of them are historians. Some of them, there's many. So the problem we have is human thought is flawed. Where do we decide the best places to garner information? Do we try? And I agree, there are lots of problems with. I think you're very loose with your definition of science-led. I think you're very loose about that term. So I don't think it is science-led. But I think it's about. To me, the most important thing is evidence-based. It comes down to this: prove it. Can you prove it? So once you can prove something, now this is a lot. Once you get into the world of politics, you're right. People will take what they want. But I don't think this image you've given, this delightfully sad image of all of these Dickensian politicians in their working house in the House of Commons being and the poor politicians being oppressed by scientists. That's just madness. That's not what we said. Do you genuinely believe that Ian Duncan Smith goes, I had this lovely idea for an education policy, but then these scientists have told me to feel the bumps on his head, and now that's not what's going on. And I think that's I've got to ask you that. This is the big question. I just want to ask this. Who then, when we are deciding on policies, when we are deciding every day on every decision we make about us, what do we use? Do we use evidence? Who makes any form of decision? Do we consider people who gather evidence to be more useful than people who just had an idea while they were on a hill and eating mushrooms? Do we consider them better or not? And I'm not saying that you may well say that the mushroom eaters are best. Some of them have been very wise. But what is the alternative that you offer as opposed to people who are basing their opinions on evidence and on building up evidence?
All right, we can just pause there. Can we just check that everyone can hear Robin at the back? Is he shouting loud enough for you?
I'm doing Lear at 7.
Right.
I do genuinely, that's what I find when I read some of your stuff. I don't understand what alternative, when we use these very emotive terms, let me go, the common man, the common woman, whatever. It's again seems to be going into a cartoon. It seems to be going into kind of 19th century etchings.
Jeff, are you conspiring against us?
I think that Brendan's point is actually a little bit more subtle, right? I think that the point is that scientists, are they colluding in playing the role of smart people, right? And everybody else is stupid, right? That's the kind of it's a seductive thing, right? If somebody says, "Come on, you're the expert, you know about these things," and you're being set up to be a high priest and to pontificate, right? And that to resist that temptation and to avoid seeing yourself as we're the smart people with the knowledge and the rest of you are all stupid. That is I've said it in I've always stated the case, but it's present, that idea, and it's hard to resist it. Is that because Robin's question to you about what was the alternative? What do we do? Right? I mean, is a good question, right? I mean, but your point is not that these scientists, there's a grand conspiracy of scientists, right? It's that scientists are kind of drawn into this process and support it through the idea that they are the fonts of knowledge.
Well, I don't know how many times I can say it without people taking it on board. The key problem is with politicians who, for various historical reasons, do not feel they have the authority to push through an agenda in the way they would have done 20 or 30 years ago. So they go looking for authority elsewhere, and they find it today in science. They find it in evidence. That's why we have evidence-based politics.
What's wrong with that?
The thing that's wrong with that is that it speaks, firstly, the first thing that's wrong is it speaks to a lack within politics. The way in which politics was done from ancient Greece onwards is that you exercised moral judgment. You made moral judgments, you took responsibility for your decisions, you tried to work out what you thought was in the interest of the public, you engaged with the public to find out if that was right or wrong. That's what politics was for 2,000, 3,000 years. What's happened over the past 30, 40 years is that politicians have lost the ability to do that, and they're outsourcing their authority, to scientists. That's what I'm talking about. So the key problem lies with politicians. However, as this process builds and builds, I think scientists are going along with it in a very worrying fashion. Now, the way I see it is that the question of what alternative I would suggest, I think we need a healthier public space. We need a healthier public space in which politics is actually discussed in a grown-up fashion, in which ordinary people are engaged in that discussion, and in which everyone can find a way to input what they think is the best thing to do with dope, or the best way to do with a neglectful parent, how should they be dealt with, or the question of whether there should be a smoking ban. The problem is, at the moment, we have a shriveled public sphere, an alienated political class, and that political class is looking for a form of authority with which it can impose its agenda, and it's doing it through science. Right? I would like it if scientists had said, no way, go, we don't want this, piss off. The whole point of our work is that it's open-ended and experimental. Unfortunately, some of them haven't said that. They have said, okay, here's a report which will really boost your policy in this area. Here's a report which will substantiate the smoking ban.
Helen.
So that's the problem.
So I appear to be, now, Jeff studies a different area of science. I could be called a climate scientist. I'm the only person on this panel that is publicly funded. I have to fight for my research grants. I have to justify doing research in this area, right? And for those of you in the room that are not familiar with how this works, it's a fight, right? Everybody is against you. When you're doing this as a scientist, you have an idea, you say, this is a good thing to do. I think this piece of science is worth doing. You fight and fight and fight. You have to use every single piece of evidence that you can find to justify your thing, that science is the right thing to do. You do your experiments, you write up the paper, and then you have to fight again to justify what you have written. You have to use the evidence. There's no room in that process for me to write a judgment influenced by a politician, because it will get shot down like everything else. Also, what scientists spend a lot of time being poked and prodded to an incredible degree and being told they're wrong, and they have to show and demonstrate that they are right. So I do not see in the scientific world what you're talking. There's no doubt we're all human beings, as Robin said. That one of the problems with being a human being is that we're all humans and people have egos and things. So I'm not saying that no scientist has ever presented an opinion for political convenience, but I'm saying that the vast majority of peer-reviewed science has been written that way for a reason. It's been written that way because there was specific evidence to state it that way, because it cannot be published otherwise.
Okay, Brian.
I think it's a more subtle process than that. I'm not saying that scientists sit down in a dark room and say, oh, we'll get £20,000 if we come up with this endpoint. I think it's a more subtle process. I think it's a corrosive process where the more scientists get brought into the political sphere, the more there is the danger that they will think politically. I'm not saying it's a conscious, conspiratorial thing. I'm just saying that that is going to be an inevitable process. The exact same thing happened with trade unions in the 1950s and 60s. The more all these kind of cap-wearing trade unionists were brought in for chats with Labour or Tory politicians, the more they sold out, the more they became
So
part
you're
of
saying
that
the politicians should never ask the scientists their opinion?
No, and I think climate scientists is actually the worst sinner in all of this, because if you look at the way in which climate science has been used, this is the most explicit example of science being used to political ends, where it's used to justify all sorts, reining in all forms of development, not building certain coal-fired stations, demonising China for polluting the environment with a certain number of particles, raising questions about what kind of a development is appropriate in Africa. All these things which were social and moral questions for decades, the question of how we develop, how we provide people with what they want and what they need, have increasingly been shrunk through the mechanism of science, through saying we can't do this because it will cause that much pollution, we can't do this because it will cause that much climate change.
That's brilliant. Example. That's exactly what science should do. If you do that, there's a 90% chance that the world will fall
I happen to think, this is quite important, I happen to think that saving people in Africa from starvation and from living in destitution is more important than stopping pollution.
But that's society's judgment. That's not
exactly.
science. That's society's
But what's
judgment.
happened is that society has given up on that project of global social development. It's given up on it. It's given up on it since the 1970s. And so it looked for a justification for that capitulation. And it found it through science. It found it through the idea of climate change.
Yeah, I think that's. I do agree. I'll just I'll echo the heckler there, which is, I think there's. You and me are both not experts, so we're good at doing opinions, and we quite often don't back them up. I think that's the thing, is a lot of the things that you've said don't seem to back up. So when you're talking about the total change in global development, I'm just interested to know, again, specific kind of statistics and what we can see, how that pans out, actually using, the statistics that you, I presume, have. I'm not saying that facetiously. I'm genuinely saying, if you're saying that, obviously you're saying that because you have read and you've got some evidence on how this global social development has been stymied since the 1970s.
Well, in the West, there has definitely been a turning against the idea of economic growth and development, unquestionably. Look at the way in which...
the practicality. I want to know the practicality, because what you've said there is that it's kind of stopped. And I know there's a lot of issues with this, again, on politics, but in terms of actual, statistics, facts and figures, and not just general opinions that it's kind of turned against, I'd like to know what you're backing that up with.
Well, look at the fact that we had a nuclear revolution in the 1950s, and now there's no European country, apart from maybe France, that will build nuclear power stations. Germany announced last year that it was closing all of its down. Britain takes 25 years to build anything, runways, nuclear power stations, whatever else. There has been, and look at the way in which development and growth are continually demonized as causing mental illness, economic destruction. In the West, there has been, since the Club of Rome, since the early 1970s, since the oil crisis, since that collapse of the political elite's gumption, there has been a turning against growth and the ideal of development and so on.
But again, you said global social development, you said Africa, not Europe. So again, I don't know, you've suddenly used Europe and Russia as examples of a slowing down of a nuclear program, which we also know there's a big debate about this at the moment, and there are certainly people within the scientific community who feel that may well be the future, and the requirement is that we are going to have to change our attitudes and opinions and use all the evidence that's been accrued over the last 50 years about power stations. But again, going back to Africa, you were specifically talking there about Africa, so not Russia and Europe.
I was just going to come on to that. I didn't mention Russia, I mentioned Europe. I was just going to come on to Africa and China.
Well, if I can just ask Jeff, because he's been very quiet at the end. Jeff, is science anti-democratic? Is it removing all these choices? Or is there another role?
This idea, so you're saying that the politicians are misusing the science, right?
That's what you're saying. No, I'm saying something more subtle than that.
I don't think you are, though. What are you saying?
Okay, well, let me... Okay,
what are you saying? I don't understand! This is why I don't go on fucking question time.
Let me ask it in a different way then, right? So there are these bunch of scientists, let's pick climate change, right, doing peer-reviewed science. Right? Should they have done something different? Right? What has gone wrong, in your view, with the process of scientists trying to understand the climate?
I think that climate science is a good example of the rather more subtle thing I'm talking about than Robin seems capable of understanding. Which is, I'll say it again. I'll say it one more time.
Well, say it
So the question is,
with evidence and say
what should the scientists have done different? Right? The climate change scientists.
What I'm saying,
in the best will in the world, we want to be educated. So what should we have done differently?
What I'm saying is there is a relationship today between politics and science, which I think is a problematic relationship. That relationship is one where politicians frequently call on science to justify an agenda or a policy that they want to push forward. Scientists have been sucked into that over a long period of time. That's what I'm saying.
So what should the scientists do?
The scientists should wriggle free from those expectations. That they should underpin.
What does wriggle free mean?
Right? They should cut loose their relationship with politicians. I think they should refuse to go along with that. I think climate scientists.
So if a politician says they're quite hard to read these papers sometimes, right? What you're saying that the scientists should produce their peer-reviewed papers and then not talk to any politicians to explain the content of them.
Look, what I'm saying is, I actually don't care what scientists do. What I'm saying is,
we better take that away.
What I'm saying in relation to scientists' relationship with politicians, I think scientists need to have a serious word with themselves about how problematic that relationship is becoming. And the reason
scientists have never met a politician.
The reason I think it's becoming problematic. Okay, so wait, are you three seriously denying that a great deal of policy these days is led by science/evidence? That, wait, number one. Number two, that some of that evidence is actually not very airtight. And number three, that even when it is, making that happen in that way elbows aside other forms of deciding what is the best course of action
what are
for
the
a
other
society
forms? That's what I want to know, because I agree there are a lot of problems. Again, the moment you get into politics, the moment you get into all manner of the kind of vicarious ways that those are dealt with, I agree there are a lot of issues. But what we need to do, again, going back to that common human being thing, is what we actually need to do is we need a better education system. We need an education system where people actually feel armed with critical thinking so they can be part of the discussion. We need politicians who are not within a political class, where they live within their own world. And you see the way that when you hear people like Osborne talking, you think you have no understanding actually of, or Ian Duncan Smith recently. These things are required. And science, I'm sure, needs also to work harder in the way that it has its discussions with politicians, and it tries to deliver evidence-based ideas. But the thing is, it needs to be a better system. What is the alternative to, when we live in, because when you say science needs to get away from politics, this world we currently live in is built on technology and science. The Western world at the moment, if you look out that window and you look at that swirling fucking madness there, all of these things, so we can't just go, there's politics and there's science, because within politics, in the same way, I'm sorry, I'm doing really quick, but it's just this thing where the world, when you talk about the ancient Greeks, the world now is incredibly complex. The level of understanding, many scientists have said this before, you can, if you're lucky, maybe be an expert on one tiny thing. We can't have these wonderful polymath politicians who will be able to understand everything, and we certainly are lacking them now. So I agree, there's a lot of problems with politicians, and maybe the debate needs to be upped, and we need to increase the amount of evidence used.
Well, talking about the debate, if we can just take a little bit of the heat out of it and cool it down a little bit, I'm sure all our speakers will be very, very pleased, because everybody should have an opportunity to get their point across. Now, I think that's a good point to start some questions. Have you got the Robbie mic? Mm-hmm. So, who's got questions? This chap here. Sorry.
I didn't know I was going to have to hold you down.
Used to see me, Stephen.
Okay. Just a quick question. It strikes me that the main thing... Sorry, addressing yourself. The main thing is you seem to not see a difference between led by and informed by. You know, you say that politics is led by people, giving them the information, the consequence of this will be. Wouldn't it be better to say the politicians are informed by being told the consequences of this are going to be? And that's a subtly different thing. And I think when you take that subtlety in, I don't think the panel differs much.
That was to you, I think, Daniel.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, obviously there is a difference between those two things, but I think, going back to the point I think I've made 3 times now, is that I think the thing is that politicians are looking for evidence that backs up what they want to do. So they're being led by what they want to do, but it's very interesting that they feel they lack the ability to justify their agenda on its own terms. That's the problematic thing. Just very quickly on Robin's points that he just made, I don't know if Robin thinks it's original to say that the world is incredibly complex and therefore it's difficult for people to understand it, because that's exactly what was said against the suffragettes, against universal male suffrage in the 19th century. Exactly word for word.
Also, wait, stop shouting. You link these, I'm sorry,
Also,
you do this in your fucking column.
Also,
you link lots of things that have bollocks, they have nothing to do with it.
Also,
the world is, look at this fucking world. Do you know how to mend your fucking iPad?
Also,
do you?
Robin, can you... I'm seriously getting worried that you're going to have a heart attack.
Well, if you didn't like what I said then, you're really not going to like what I say now. If you also think it's original to say that in order to improve politics we need to educate the public, then you're a fucking idiot. Because that is exactly what racists said in America in the 1950s and 60s. The reason
education needs to improve.
Yeah, exactly.
You think education is good in this country?
The reason black people can't be involved in politics is because they lack the expertise.
I want people involved in politics. You don't understand a word I say.
The similarity between what I'm talking about, which is what I talked about in my introduction, which people generally ignore, the similarity between what people are saying about expertise now and what people said about expertise in the 19th, 20th century, that's what's very striking. These things are similar because I think they are driven by similar urges, which is an urge to keep politics as a sphere for people who know more than the man in the street. I think that is problematic.
Right, can we move on to the next question? Give Robin a chance to calm down.
I can feel my fucking
So first, I don't understand how Robin is remaining so calm, actually. In any case, I want to pick up one point you said, which I really have a hard time understanding. You said politics used to be based on making moral decisions, not using evidence, but making, just a moral decision. How can you make a moral decision without evidence? And if you do that, that moral decision is worth nothing. For example, let's say you make the moral decision that homosexuality is evil and that homosexuals shouldn't be allowed to marry or have other human rights. Okay, but you don't use the evidence that in almost all species we look at that homosexuality is 10% of the time in sheep, for example, who don't even have morality but nevertheless have homosexuality. So if you make that decision as a moral decision, it is indeed a moral decision, but it's a stupid decision. So in the absence of evidence, what's the point of moral decisions?
Okay, before you answer, I should stress that other panelists are available.
Yes, good point. The thing, I think morality can run against evidence. Morality can ignore evidence. For example, I agree that smoking dope a lot is probably not very good for you. I certainly agree that taking heroin is probably not very good for you. But my morality tells me that people should be free to do that. I think there should be no legal restrictions on any drugs. We should be free to go and come out and buy heroin. That's a moral decision because I trust in people's moral autonomy to decide what's best in their lives. Now, if you have scientists and politicians coming together saying heroin is really dangerous in these various ways, as David Nutt says, he likes dope, he doesn't like heroin, then they restrict people's access to it, which I think is immoral. So the evidence there is immoral. It's used in an immoral way, and it's used purposefully in an immoral way. So I think my morality often runs against what is available scientifically, and that's, I think, goes for lots of people. Our morality doesn't...
That's not your morality running against the scientific evidence, because the scientific evidence just says...
It's bad. It doesn't say you shouldn't use it. It just says it's bad.
What people do with that is that's what politics is.
But it's being informed by your knowledge.
But if you look at this is the point I was making earlier on. If you look at the way in which the government uses its drugs advisory committee, it does it in order to justify banning drugs.
Wasn't that why Professor Nutt resigned?
And the scientists play along with that brilliantly. They say, including David Nutt, he was perfectly happy for heroin and cocaine to be restricted to the public. He just had a problem with dope because he thinks dope is fantastic. So that's what I'm talking about. The way in which politicians and scientists...
Not true.
The way in which politicians and scientists get together and use scientific evidence to say, okay, this drug should be restricted.
Okay.
I think we should exercise moral judgment in relation to those things, not scientific judgment, which David Nutt did along with all the others before the dope.
Okay, next question. Can we have something that perhaps Jeff or Helen could field?
Can I...
I've got the microphone. This is kind of to Brendan. I mean, he seemed to me to be saying that because we don't like and trust politicians, that we therefore shouldn't talk to them. That seems crazy to me. I mean, the whole point is we should inform the politicians' thinking by giving them more science, talking to them more, having more debate, more openness. That seems to be the crux of it. Just because most people don't like politicians nowadays doesn't mean we shouldn't talk to them.
I know you directed that at Brendan, but I'm going to bring Jeff in on that.
Yeah, well, I'm going to ask a question of Brendan. I mean, I'm sorry, Brendan. I actually, in my opening remarks, really wanted to kind of touch on this issue of scientists, in a sense, colluding with politicians unconsciously by and not properly respecting the role that judgment plays in non-scientific judgment in making decisions, either because something's very complicated, or usually because something's very complicated, and there are questions of morality and so on. And that they can be the dominant component in the decision-making process should be appreciated by scientists. And I think largely it is, right? Brendan seems to think that it is not, right? That scientists are colluding by providing the ammunition for these politicians to make it gives them an easy route to making the decisions that they want to make, and that the scientists should be aware of that when they're providing their advice. I probably would agree with that. The scientists should be aware that the way that they present their advice could be misused. But I ask Brendan again, what would you have the science, apart from what I've said? If you agree with what I've said, then say so. If not, then how would you have scientists behave differently?
Brendan.
I think the relationship has now become so entangled between scientists and politicians that we need to rethink it. And I think we need to get rid of all these advisory bodies that are giving governments advice, because we know it's no good for scientists to say, oh, I didn't know my evidence was going to be used to ban heroin, or I didn't know it was going to be used to ban smoking in pubs. If you read newspapers, if you know how authoritarian governments in Britain have been since the New Labour government, you know very well that is how your evidence is going to be used. So there's no excuse for it. And David Nutt is a perfect example of this. There's no point him flouncing out just because they went against what he said about dope, when he had gone along with bans on heroin and cocaine and every other drug that people should have free access to. So scientists know that there is a political agenda, that drugs are going to be banned, energy policy is going to be transformed, children's education is going to be reformulated in a certain way. They know there's going to be a policy endpoint to the advice they're giving. On that basis, they should either refuse to get involved, or they should do it on much clearer terms, where they retain their independence and refuse to kowtow to what governments want to do. That's what I'm saying. Again, I want to say the prime problem is with politicians, but I think scientists are dangerously being sucked into this, and it's calling into question the reliability of science.
I think we've got a question there, Rick, have we?
I really do want to put a question to Jeff.
Which one?
Forshaw. Who seemed to be saying that he didn't see any particular reason to want to have scientists in Parliament. I, of course, want to have in Parliament people that we vote for, because I'm a Democrat. But if you ask me who I would vote for, all other things being equal, and I mean all other things being equal, of course I would vote for a scientist, and I have for the last 4 elections, namely the great Evan Harris, of the Oxford constituency. And the reason is not just that scientists know things, which is what we've been talking about so far, but scientists know how to think. They know how to think logically, they know how to evaluate evidence, they know how to evaluate risk, they know how to come to a judgment, and judgment is what we need in politicians, as has been said. And scientists, in my opinion, are well qualified to make exactly the sorts of judgments which politicians have to make, and reflect that the majority of our politicians at present are actually lawyers. Do we really want that?
Jeff, can you answer that briefly, because we're getting very close to the end of the time.
Okay, I mean, of course, I don't think that scientists should be excluded from Parliament. The point wasn't that, of course. But this statement about scientists know how to think, I think that that's to a certain extent true, but making the kind of judgments that are needed in Parliament, it requires that people understand. There are lots of things other than the analytic process involved in evaluating scientific evidence and drawing scientific conclusions that are needed to make good decisions and good judgment in governance. The kind of things that are informed very well by people who've got a background in the arts and humanities. So we're talking about making decisions that concern people's lives and the way they live. That requires a judgment and an ability to understand people, which scientists are no better qualified. I don't know, they need be no worse qualified than other people. But those aspects, I think, are very, very important in the judgment, in the process. So I think it's to overstate things to think that every decision that governments make, the judgments that need to be made, are best made by people who think in scientific terms. I don't think that's true.
And I think that is an absolutely perfect point on which to end. Can I thank my panellists, Brendan O'Neill, Robin Ince, Helen Czerski and Jeff Forshaw.